No catchy jingles from me because I'm musically inept. Hello, Internet. So before we start on what I actually want to talk about today, I wanted to tell you a little story. I was talking to somebody last week about my most recent video on Plato, and he said, oh, I really enjoyed it. And I said, fantastic, what did you like about it? Because if somebody watches what I do and they like a particular bit of it, I want to do more of that stuff. And his response was, you look like Stephen Merchant, which was great. Anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. This is the first part of an on and off mini-series that I'm going to be doing over the next few months in a predictably on and off sort of fashion. I was in an English interview last year, and one of the questions that I got asked was, what's the point of poetry? And I opened my mouth getting ready to wax lyrical about exploration of emotion and expression of feeling and owls and pussycats and all that stuff. And I realised that, actually, I had no idea. And the truth is I still don't. So what this little project is going to be about is looking at poetry, writing poems, the lives of poets, and ultimately looking at what makes poetry, poetry. So for the first of these little explorations, I thought we'd focus on John Clare, because one of the biggest complaints that I've heard about poetry is that getting to anything good, and I use the word good advisedly, requires you to muddle through all these poems about landscapes and rural living and things that don't seem to say an awful lot, or, in other words, boring poems. While I can't stop you finding them boring, hopefully I can show you that even in the simplest poems, sometimes much more is being said than we might think. As part of a little experiment that should become clearer as these videos go on, I'm not going to give you any more contextual background to Clare other than the fact that he lived in the 19th century and that he wrote poems. Clare is one of the poets who is hypothetically guilty of writing hypothetically boring poems about the country and rural living, but the fact that he's part of this hypothetical problem makes him an ideal part of the all-too-real solution. The snow has left the cottage top, the thatch moss grows in brighter green, and eaves in quick succession drop, where grinning icicles have been. So begins Februari, one of the 12 poems that comprise Clare's The Shepherd's Calendar. Call it boring if you will, but prepare to be wrong! As far as landscape poets go, Clare is certainly one of the finest when it comes to detail. Look at the fact that he notices that a specific kind of moss turns a different shade of green in a particular month. I don't know what this is. Just from these 4 lines then it becomes clear that we're dealing with a poet with an extraordinary eye for spotting minute details. But that's boring, of course it is. Who cares about moss? Stop right there, hypothetically naive me. When we're talking about poetry, this is entirely the wrong question to be asking. What we should be asking ourselves is, why does Clare care so much about moss that he chooses to include it in one of his poems? At this point it may be useful to have read The Shepherd's Calendar, but it doesn't matter if you haven't. Given the fact that the poems describe the passing of a year, it shouldn't come as a shock to us that the passing of time is one of the major themes of the poems. But it seems that rather than just spanning across 1 year, the poems actually take place over the course of a lifetime. The early poems describe childhood years, whereas December ends with a contemplation of the death of an unnamed poet. It doesn't take much to work out that Clare is writing about his own life in these poems, and in fact poets use their lives as subjects all too often, but Clare seems to take things a bit further. After a description of a January evening, and hence an evening in his childhood, Clare writes, "Ah, where is page of poesy, so sweet as this was wont to be?" Clare wasn't writing about moss. He was writing about his childhood and how he would have given anything he could to have relived it. His was a life of solitude, poverty, and lost love, and he found solace from these things by reliving his childhood through his poetry. What's the point of poetry then? It seems so far that it's about escape, but more than that, it's about preservation. As Clare's life went on, he became more and more mentally unstable, but he continued writing poetry, and even at the point when he was so deranged he thought he was Shakespeare, he carried on trying to preserve the world that he built for himself in his poetry. So that's part 1 of our little mission to uncover the point of poetry. Next week we'll do something slightly different, but for now I'll leave you with a thought from William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news from poetry, but men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. I'll see you next week.